Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first NATS chat of 2022. I'm Kari, Ragan, moderator of NATS chats, which are sponsored by Inside View Press. And I'm so pleased to be joined tonight by Justin Moniz, Melissa Foster, and Elizabeth Benson. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Of course.
We are going to discuss pop rock, let's see, what did we call it? Contemporary vocal styles, demystifying the pedagogical process specifically for pop rock. And before we launch into our topic though, I would love to just have each of you share a little bit about Beyond the Bio, something we don't read in your biography that helps us to understand what's led you to be where you are in our voice teaching profession. Justin, would you like to begin?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, you know, I've always had a passion for pop and rock music, music theater specifically, but growing up was never encouraged to pursue that, more so music education. So I really started as a music education major and got to college, and then, you know, was sort of driving and I switched. I switched to vocal performance, and you know, I've been really fortunate through my degrees and through my training to always be working with teachers who are very open to the exploration of things beyond the classical canon, if you will. So I've had some wonderful experiences through my formal training that have allowed me to really branch out and to cross over, I guess, in the extreme sense of the word, which has led me here to pop and rock and much of what I do in my current work. So.
I love that. Thank you, Justin. Melissa, share with us a bit about Beyond the Bio.
Sure. Well, something that I think is, some people might know about me, but is a bit interesting in my path, is that I started out as an opera singer, and I was 20, I think I was 22, I was going to I was leaving school early to go to Central City for an apprenticeship, and I got ill, and it became a big proportion trying to figure out a mystery of why I could not speak, which is very weird for an opera major not to be able to talk. And it was handled after a few years, but by then I had, you know, graduated and said, I can't really talk much and I don't know what I'm going to do in my life. And so my voice teacher from high school just so happened to be retiring. And she said, I have an entire voice studio of, you know, high schoolers and junior high and things like that. Would you like that? And I'm like, well, I'm 22, don't know what I'm doing, but sure I would, you know. And so I sort of got thrown in and I just loved it. But what I loved the most was trying to figure out demystify the myth of belting and musical theater, because way back then that was still, you know, considered. And so I became sort of a mystery solver, and, you know, learning that and sort of branching out into that whole realm of science and understanding, you know, the actual voice and more methodologies, et cetera, et cetera. And that sort of led me down my path, and then that led me down my path of pop rock sounds. I mean, so it keeps going. And, you know, I guess that's sort of why I am so interested in this, and that's why I am now very passionate about rap and hip hop. So it keeps, you know, I keep winding down the road of, well, why don't people talk about this? Well, what have they not analyzed? And why don't I know this? And I want to know this. So that's sort of how I began my teaching and the windy road of my curiosity.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And Elizabeth.
So I was always interested in being a singer. I loved singing itself, and from a very early age, and had a lot of great experiences in choir and in community musical theater. I was avid consumer of pop rock, and especially in my teenage years. And then when I went into formal study, of course, I specialized, and classical was the path that was really recommended to me by a lot of my mentors. So all my formal education is in classical vocal performance. But I started teaching as soon as I was sort of out of my coursework of my doctorate. I started teaching, and immediately all the demand was for musical theater. And so that's why I sort of went back. For me, it's like kind of full circle, coming back around to loving the musical theater canon that I grew up with and, you know, have always enjoyed participating in. And then once I was actually already hired in my job at Auburn, and I went to the NATS conference that summer before I started, and I went to Sherry Sanders' pre-conference workshop, and it sort of blew the roof off this idea that the musical theater canon is somehow separate from pop and rock. And I was actually really thrilled, because for me, this was like, okay, good. I don't have to keep the secret that I love pop rock anymore. I don't have to like somehow keep my worlds siloed in these separate vectors. I can enjoy all the kinds of singing under one roof. And I just felt like I was home, you know, that like, so that's really for me what it's about. I mean, I love all the music I've ever sung and studied, and I love that I don't have to choose.
Isn't that one of the greatest things about our changing profession right now? You know, I come from the generation where teachers or students were hiding, still do depending on the teacher, that they're out singing in a rock band on the weekend and then coming to class and studying to have a vocal performance degree in classical aesthetic. That still goes on at universities, you know. So we've come a long way, baby. You know, we've got more to go. And I want to say that up front, that I am really proud to be a part of an organization that has to meet the needs of a variety of voice teachers that are moving our profession forward in a number of ways. And we have to serve the needs of all of those members now. And so we're trying to keep up with it. To that end, let's start a little bit there. What kind of big picture, what are the stylistic parameters of the pop rock canon? Justin, would you like to lead us off, and then Elizabeth and Melissa can add on?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. You know, one of the things I find myself talking to my students about and my graduate pedagogy students about is this idea of technique versus style, and sort of where we draw that line. You know, the daunting thing about the pop rock canon is that there are so many subgenres in the canon. You know, I like to describe it as this pop rock umbrella, if you will. And then underneath it, you know, we have all the subgenres, everything from Motown to 70s folk rock to disco, 80s pop rock, you know, hip hop, R&B. And, you know, there are so many facets, if you will, that are a part of what we do in the world of pop rock and the world of contemporary vocal styles. So I think that's daunting. And I think the thing we need to sort of ask ourselves, you know, what stylistic parameters need be in place to be authentic in each of these styles. So I'd like to start with the conversation of technique versus style. What are the technical foundational elements, if you will, that need to sort of remain constant? And then where do we as teachers encourage and guide our students to make those tweaks that will still allow them to be efficient and sustainable and be flexible enough to move into these different subgenres, if you will? So from my perspective, it can be a really daunting thing, simply because there are so many avenues, you know, within this world of pop rock. But I think the thing we need to come back to, and the thing I like to ask many of the teachers that I work with, is it efficient and is it sustainable? Not, do I like this? Because we all have our thoughts, our likes, our desires, and, you know, their aesthetics. You know, certain things are pleasing to one person and might not be to the other. So sort of starting there, you know, technique, style, efficiency, and sustainability, I say, is my departure point.
And I think it's okay if you don't like it, if it's not an aesthetic you like, that it's okay not to teach it. You know, I think you have to like. I have no interest in working with the scream that Melissa Cross is so well known for, right? That's just, I would not enjoy a day listening to that. And so I wouldn't teach that, right? So I think it's okay. And again, because there's such a variety for us to pick from, it's okay to pick a niche and work towards that, and then refer to your colleagues. Elizabeth, I'd love to hear what you have to say about kind of the stylistic parameters.
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree with Justin about really separating function, and style, so that you're looking at, you have technical pillars that you may or may not apply depending on the style that you're working in, but you have basically a basic set of skills that you draw from. But then really understanding the stylistic parameters, the stylistic expectations, so that you sound authentic in all of those styles is daunting is a good word for it. I think a stronger word would be even better. But I think that, you know, every singer is going to have areas that, like, styles that suit their voice. And when we're training for musical theater, we're training versatility of styles. We're training for them to be able to step into a role that is, you know, completely different than the role they sang yesterday. And they need to know, our students need to know, what are the stylistic parameters that I need to turn on and turn off for this style, and where do I shine as a singer. And so I think it is important, just like you said, Kari, to know where you are good as a teacher. I know my own strengths and weaknesses and what I can and cannot authentically offer to my students. And I absolutely think it's essential for us to refer out when it's not a style that's part of my musical heritage, as in I didn't grow up listening to it, or I haven't immersed myself enough to really understand the style. Then I would always prefer to refer out to a stylistic expert. And with COVID, you know, we've got so much zooming in to classes now that's happening, and there's more access than ever to our colleagues. And so I think that has done great things for our students, and also for our own understanding our own limitations, you know, and that's a good thing to model for students too, to say, hey, I'm not the best person to teach you this, but I know someone who is, and I'm going to get you guys connected. So that's how I approach it too.
I love how our field is changing with regard to that, you know, that we don't have to be the gatekeeper of all, you know, that it's okay to say to your student, hey, you know, I know somebody who specializes in Baroque ornamentation, you know, go have some coachings. Melissa.
Hi, well, I'll just quickly, I mean, I echo their sentiments that have already been said. I do think that it does sometimes get cloudy with the style and technique. And so, you know, the beginning singer, you know, understanding that skipping steps right to the style sometimes won't behoove you for, I love that you said, Justin, efficient. I have a huge board in my studio that says just in one word, efficiency, and I just point to it sometimes. And you know, to make sure that the technique is underneath the singer, and also to understand that there are different elements of technique or function that will shift depending on styles, and that's okay too, you know, and to make those clarity, you know, that clear to students. I think there are so many styles and subgenres that are, I think niche is exactly the right word, and also referring out is exactly, I'm echoing it all, but I guess I just want to add that, you know, to continue to be curious and listen. I'm always trying to listen and learn more about styles I don't know a lot about, so that I, you know, can help as much as possible if a student does need to be flexible quickly.
Thank you, Melissa. And just to let the attendees know, we are going to get more into the weeds about the stylistic and technical differences. We're just starting with some broad strokes, so be patient as we get there. Let's talk for a moment about, why does pop rock challenge pedagogic norms? And is that true anymore, Justin? Like, is it still challenging our pedagogic norms? Where are we as, let's say, as a profession and an organization with regard to that?
Yeah, you know, I think it still does challenge the norms, and you know, when you look at the vast majority of voice teachers and the opportunities or the degree paths which one can pursue, there just aren't as many. I mean, there are very few that exist that cater specifically, or even, dare I say, allow or encourage the exploration of CCM pedagogy. We've come a long way in recent years, and there's really an emergence, because I think we as voice teachers, as a community of learners, are quickly recognizing, we need to expand our scope to be able to adequately prepare, these artists and the demands that they're facing in this industry. So I definitely think we're still challenging norms in that regard, because much of what we talk about, and I guess not getting too into the weeds, though I'm very excited to get into the weeds, are some of those approaches that, sort of seem fundamental. We're talking about the breath, we're talking about laryngeal position, we're talking often, especially those who have trained classically, which I would venture to say are the majority of voice teachers, we're talking about a high and lifted palate. And when we start to get into the weeds with some of this, specifically belt function, specifically affect on the voice, those are what we consider foundational elements that need to be addressed and changed, and dare I even say tweaked, recalibrated. So there are so many things I think we just think, okay, I say we as somebody who also is trained classically, all my degrees, bachelor's through doctorate, classical voice. And we sort of comment into this approach of low larynx, low breath, high palate. And when we try to take that approach and that methodology, if you will, into CCM repertoire, it starts to become very inauthentic, starts to sound a bit funky, and sort of outside what we perceive as the norm or the expectation in whatever that aesthetic or that style might be. So that's what I would say.
I love that. Elizabeth or Melissa? Yeah, Melissa, I can tell you're.
Sure. I think, not only, I agree with everything, and I'll just add, in addition to, sounding weird, it can also be inefficient and ineffective. And this, the students might be unable to get the style and the sound that they're hoping to get. So I do agree that it has come a long way from, if you can sing classical, you can sing anything, and everything should just be taught through bel canto. I'll just choose one. Pedagogy. And I think, while also bel canto pedagogy is wonderful. I know I'm classically trained too, and just understanding the differences and how it's extremely important that you as a teacher understand that, I guess that it's science-based, and that the voice can make a lot of different sounds based on laryngeal flexibility and all of the things that people are saying. And so I think I think it is still challenging the norm because things move slowly in academia, and, launches of new programs, take a long time, but I do think it's moving. And I think people are really interested and dedicated to that. And supportive.
Understatement of the year, things move slowly in academia. They do. So let me ask this. Is pop rock different when we're talking how it lives in music theater? Because first of all, people talk about music theater and there's still this notion of music theater is one thing. It's not one thing anymore, right? I mean, it's everything. So is pop rock different that lives in musical theater than pop rock outside of music theater?
Yes, absolutely. I would venture to say that if you're studying to become a musical theater performer, you have to be able to step into a multitude of styles. And so you are, as I mentioned before, you're training versatility, you're training adaptability. And if you want to become a pop rock star of some kind and have your own sound, your own signature sound, you're training to specialize. And so those are two completely different paths. And I would, just to briefly revisit our last question, I would disagree about challenging the norms. Maybe pop rock is challenging the norms of academia, but there have been independent studio teachers teaching pop rock for decades, and they have been serving the professional community for a really long time, and it's just not been integrated into academia until musical theater paved the way, and now pop rock programs are coming up too. But I would say that really I always say this to my students when we have a themed class. Okay, we're gonna have disco class today. I always say, if you want to go become a disco star, I'm gonna refer you out to an expert, because I'm only gonna go surface level with this. I'm gonna go as deep as you need to go to understand what the musical theater expectations are in this industry. But I am not here to train you to become the next big disco star. And that's not our objective in a training program anyway, in an undergrad program, in a curriculum that's already very full. We don't have the time to go in depth, really hardcore into these styles. So I don't want to ever discourage anybody if they want to explore it deeper, but in terms of what I'm going to put out on a curriculum or what I'm going to be able to fit into my voice curriculum, I can only do a little bit of each style. So 100%. What I love is that there's now a sort of coming together of these worlds of the, independent teachers who have been serving the pop rock community for decades, coming together with voice science and with folks who are in academia who are looking at a multitude and breadth of styles. And I love that these sort of walls are coming down, and that we're really getting a more integrated culture of voice teachers.
Love that. Well, let's head into the weeds a little bit. Let's just dip our toe in and then we'll go further. Are we adequately equipping our students to be successful in this pop rock dominated music theater industry?
Yes and no. So first of all, I mean, there's so much to be discussed here, and I know we're trying to get through as much of the weeds as we can. But I first want to say that, for so long, CCM, if you will, and musical theater were looked at as different things. And as musical theater has become more representative of pop and rock music, not only is it making an appearance in the canon and being programmed, on Broadway and tours and what have you, but the way by which students are being assessed, or artists, if you will, are being assessed, is their ability to not sing contemporary musical theater. If we look at the breakdowns, the students are asked, I say students, artists, excuse me, are being asked to bring in pop and rock cuts. And so what I'm finding now is that I'm spending quite a bit less time working on just contemporary musical theater. I'm now trying to balance that contemporary side with a fair amount of pop and rock so that students and artists have the appropriate material to bring in, because I don't think that there is sort of like silos, if you will. To Elizabeth's point, I think it's a brilliant one in that when we're training like somebody who is a commercial voice specialist, if you will, or a pop or rock singer, it's discovering one's unique instrument, and it's a little bit more niche. So there's probably less of an emphasis on versatility, whereas in musical theater, there's going to be a bit more because we've got to change depending upon what contract we're going out for, But I do think that with pop and rock specifically, it becomes, pretty complicated because there are so many more considerations that need to be made in terms of how are we sounding authentic in Latin pop. What changes then when we're going to fairy or to country? There are different approaches we need to make, and so it's exciting, but certainly it's something that we need to continue to ask ourselves. And I just wanted to say to Elizabeth, I love that comment, regarding that sort of emphasis on leaning into what is unique in the pop and the rock world, as opposed to training the versatility. So thank you for that.
So Elizabeth, why don't you talk to us a little bit about what is currently being taught in the applied voice setting with regard to pop rock?
Well, I think you would get a different answer from all three of us if you asked us this question, and probably at every university you're going to get a different answer. This is definitely going to take us into the weeds a little bit, so I hope that's okay. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that there are standards, and I was just looking at the NASM standards to see if they had put any language in about pop rock, just to sort of see as the handbook gets updated every year. And indeed, there's no mention of it. There's no mention of it in the musical theater sort of student learning outcomes that they outline, and that's the accrediting body for a lot of universities. So I would say that what it says is something like, know the musical theater canon. Well, the musical theater canon has changed drastically in the last 10, 15 years. And it is now very heavily leaning pop rock, like 70% of what's happening on Broadway is pop rock. So I think that, knowing what happened, in the first part of the canon is one thing, but I think Justin's absolutely right that like it's so heavy leaning into pop rock, especially in the initial audition stage, that even I've heard even of shows that are not, it's not a pop rock show necessarily, it's a contemporary musical theater show like a Dear Evan Hansen, for example, but they're asking you to bring in pop rock. Even for the prelims. That's not a real example. That didn't actually happen from Dear Evan Hansen, but just as an example. So it's a show like a jukebox musical you would expect, you know, they're definitely gonna ask for pop rock, or a new musical written by a pop artist, you would expect it. But I've heard of this even now, that it's sort of leaning in that direction. And one of the great reasons for that is that when you're singing pop rock, you're not playing a character. And you're a persona, or you know, you can certainly make up a backstory, but casting directors are particularly interested in you showing who you are and using pop rock as a vehicle to display your uniqueness, who you are as a person, not as an actor. And so it is a really unique sort of vehicle, I think, for getting to know people when you're sitting behind the audition table and you've got to cast a show and you've got a bunch of people you've never met before. It's a really great way, a powerful way to get to know them. So yeah, so those are my initial thoughts on that. But yeah, there's a lot to it. Melissa.
You know, and I'm just going to jump on just one thing you said, and then we can circle back to me if we want to talk about, you know, what I'm thinking in general. But, you know, and not only does a pop rock song let you see the person and the individual and their take on a song when you get to step outside of the boundaries and the parameters of a specific character. But a lot of times a show that you might not necessarily think is, you know, you would think of it as contemporary musical theater, is pop rock. You know, if you start thinking about instrumentation and, you know, pulse and, you know, and styles, right? And so, you know, if I use Mean Girls, for example, you know, it would make perfect sense to me to, of course, bring in a pop song, you know, because there are so many, I mean, there are so many genres of, you know, and styles of pop rock within Mean Girls that I'd want to see what you'd think, what you'd latch onto that would help me understand how you fit in the show, how you see yourself in the show. So, I mean, it gives so much information, and it also connects musically to the scores. So, I mean, it's starting to, those two things are starting to, you know, authenticity and, you know, musicality are meshing in a way that I think is incredible and fun.
Catherine asked a question that is kind of tangential to what I asked about pop rock and music theater is different than a rock band. So do most of your students, are they doing both, or do they tend to be one or the other? And how does your approach change? Anyone can jump in.
Well, maybe I'll speak to this because I actually launched a pop rock ensemble at NYU where I teach. You know, there are certain differences, you know, in terms of how one might inhabit performing with the band, the rock band, as opposed to performing in musical theater. But I think when done authentically, you know, 70s rock is 70s rock, whether it's fronting a band or whether it's in the context of a musical. And so I think there's a lot of carryover, if you will. You know, in order to sing authentically in country, there needs to be a level of twang, right? If we're singing in a country musical or we're singing in a country, leading a country band, it's the same setup in terms of those expectations and those parameters that need to be in place. I think where the change is, as Elizabeth so eloquently said, and as Melissa also added, you know, is in terms of taking it out of a character and allowing it to be a little bit more inherently you as an individual, as opposed to fitting inside something else. So, you know, I think it's a great question, but I sort of come back to, does it need to be different? Should it be different? You know, one of the things we're doing at NYU, we have a contemporary voice program, but we're trying to provide musical theater singers authentic pop rock experiences, which is why I don't let any musical theater stylisms try to infiltrate what we do in that ensemble. I don't even like to pick songs that have appeared in musicals because I don't want musical theater singers or anybody approaching it as they remember it from some cast recording. trying to get away from that as much as possible to really immerse ourselves in the authenticity of whatever that style is. So I don't know if they need to be different, if they should be different, but I guess it's open-ended, depending upon what you're looking to do.
Elizabeth
I
or
think that
Melissa?
can also depend on, the show that, the musical theater show. And sometimes there might be larger differences in the genre. I think that there are bigger differences, for instance, in rap for musical theater than rap. That I think those differences that chasm is larger than maybe, 60s surf rock.
Yeah, I agree. I think some components that are different that come to mind. One is mic technique. If you're using a handheld mic versus having one stuck to your body and it's totally controlled by someone else, that makes a big difference. And now there are some shows, Six, they're using handheld mics. So, there are definitely some shows that have moments for that, but that's a whole nother lesson to learn, is how to use that mic to your advantage. There's a lot of detail to that and a lot of practice that's needed to really become an expert at that. And then the other big difference that I hear a lot of is diction. And so, in musical theater, we still want to hear the words. We still want to understand what you're saying at all times, no matter what the style is. And in pop rock, when I'm at a pop rock concert, I don't always care what the words are. I'm okay if I can't understand them. So, so I think that that's a big difference in terms of what your audience expects, and you as a performer. So even if I'm performing, my most authentic, Motown sound, I'm going to have way more diction, than I would if I were fronting a band. And then certainly if you're leading a band, you have to lead the band. You have to know how to count off the band, and there's certainly other components to collaboration and ensemble there. I would also venture to say you need to know your sound equipment a little bit more firsthand than if you have a great sound design team working as part of your musical theater collaboration. So those are some of the, I think, technical differences. And I know for me, in my very full undergraduate curriculum, there's certainly not a lot of space for these things. So, we just did a unit on mic technique, handheld mic technique, because we were doing Spring Awakening, and there were a couple of numbers in it where we wanted to use handheld mics. And I was like, hey, that's something that the students don't know. So we're going to have to make sure we set aside rehearsal time to go over that and to let them practice with the equipment in the space. And that, it's time consuming in a collaborative process, but I said that's not something they've learned anywhere else or would have had reason to learn before this experience.
Let's live there for just a minute. I want to get into the actual singing technique, breathing. There's questions coming in about that, but let's live for a moment with mic technique without giving us a dissertation. What are some broad strokes that teachers maybe miss that were classically trained and now we're working with pop rock artists? What are some tips that you can give us?
I'll jump in here to say proximity is a big thing that I'm working with singers, and being able to use the mic to sort of help create different sounds, depending upon the angle and the way by which you're using it. I find a lot of singers are a little uncomfortable at first and the mic is a bit too far away. When we're looking for affect and breathiness and we want to hear those things present, we need to really consider proximity, same as you would in a recording studio. If you want the breath to be picked up, you need to breathe closer to the mic. So there are things, I think, specifically with proximity is where I spend a bit of time, and also the way in which students are angling the mic. I find that more often than not, they're a little reluctant to get too close. Especially for those singers who have maybe trained music theater or even classically, because they're worried about feedback or they're worried about X, Y, and Z. Whereas often in these settings we can tell them, okay, well, this is going to be handled by an engineer, or this is going to be handled by somebody else. So that's what I would say first and foremost is proximity.
But I would say also too, when you want to, if you're in a show, in a musical theater show, and you're using a handheld mic, we still want to see your mouth. And that's probably not true of pop rock singers. It doesn't matter to me if I see someone's mouth, but for the acting, you want your full face present. So you have to be careful about the position of the mic too. You don't want it like covering your mouth because we'll miss a lot. But proximity is so important, like Justin said. So like learning to put the mic kind of like at the chin as opposed to at the lips, which is what we're sort of naturally wanting to do, just so that your acting remains intact as well. And so, but yeah, proximity and angle, those are the big factors. How to hold it too. A lot of people cup the screen portion, and that causes like a muffle in the sound. Sound engineers don't appreciate it. So, so just, practice holding it, practice grabbing it, putting it in and out of the stand without it making a big thunk noise, just, practicality of these things as well. And then with COVID, certainly, sanitation and all of those other factors. If you've got a handheld that's being passed around, for example, you have to put in a safety protocol, a cleaning protocol as well.
Yeah, and I just want to add one tiny thing with proximity, that can change within a phrase, certainly, and even within a note, right? And to know that, in fact, that's pretty common, right? That will work to your advantage, that, you might want to hold the mic farther away when, for different reasons, and when based on vibrato, based on volume, based on again how much breathiness you're using, and that again might change within your phrase, might change with your diction, might change with your meaning. So knowing that those angles and everything, it's constantly shifting. I think that's important to know too. Instead of just thinking, well, if I learn this for this song or this show, then I know how to hold it. It's a tool that is such a great assist. And the more you know how to finesse and use that tool, the better.
So let's go further into the weeds and talk about basic techniques for pop rock. Thank you, John Paul, for initiating this part of the conversation. He says, is breathing different? Is resonance different? Is the laryngeal position different? So let's go for it and talk about some of those differences. I'm going to assume differences between our one extreme of classical aesthetic and then pop rock. Who wants to leap in?
I would say yes, all those things are different. And then they're going to be different depending on what pop rock style you're singing. So I think those are variables that's a part of understanding stylistic parameters, is what technical things do I need to shift in my default settings in order to sound authentic in this style. And that's something it's hard to get to that point, I think, without a certain amount of immersion and practice and a lot of listening and a lot of exposure, because you want to still have some creativity, flexibility, individuality within a given style. You don't want to just sound like a disco robot, but I think that without a deep understanding of the context and the culture and the roots of the music and listening to a lot of singers in that style, it's hard to play within the parameters. So that's certainly a challenge in a musical theater program where we're just scratching the surface of certain styles. But I think that's where, if you are then, graduated and you're going to audition for a disco show, I mean, you better give yourself a big long crash course and make sure you really understand the style as best you possibly can before you, walk in for that audition. So yes, I would say those technical pillars are always changing. So, and like to Melissa's recent point, maybe even within a song, I'm going to sometimes use my resonance in a certain way, and I'm going to sometimes use it in a different way, depending on what's happening at that moment.
I guess I'll jump in here. I just finished writing an article for the Journal of Singing that will be out in May and June, so I'll use this as an opportunity for a shameless plug. But I talk about a number of these things in that article, and I'm eager to share that, with our community. It is so hard, and I think, you talk to 2, 3, 4, 5 different teachers who specialize in this, and you're going to get 5 different answers. It becomes personal, but as we come back to this idea, Kari, as you've so eloquently written about yourself, evidence-based vocal pedagogy, relying on voice science to drive, relying on experiences of established professionals, and being able to craft, dare I say, a bulleted list based on a combination of these things. I guess I'll just go quickly through my pillars here. As Elizabeth said, many of them do change, but I like to build a fraction, and I put on the bottom what I call the common denominator. And those are things that we need to consider regardless of the style. And, breath is obviously one of those things, because without breath, there's no phonation. But I think the way in which we use the breath, the phrases we need to consider, it's something like if a plane were to fly from New York to LA, there would be a full tank of fuel, if you will. If a plane was flying from New York to Boston, it would be very dangerous to, put all that jet fuel aboard, because then you have to land with this full tank. Similarly, with the breath in pop and rock, our phrases are much shorter, generally speaking. They're a little bit more disjunct. The voice is being used as a rhythmic maker. So we're not being tasked with these, gargantuan phrases. So we need to consider the way by which we take in the breath. We need to consider the way by which we calibrate that airflow. So I do think that while breath needs to be considered, it might change depending on the style. There's no, I think, one size fits all, because the way I coach a singer to use breath in Motown is very different than the way I coach a singer to use breath in, say, fairy singer-songwriter. And it would probably be different too if we're talking 80s rock. So those things are really important to consider. Another big one is laryngeal elevation. We get into this idea of the bel canto approach, as Melissa said, a low larynx, we want to keep it really low. And in order to belt and to get that aesthetic that's necessary to create that timbre that we're after, we need to allow the larynx to move into more an elevated position, if you will. So that if we're trying to depress the larynx consistently, it becomes very hard then to achieve that belt. Similarly with the soft palate, we've all, I say we've all as our classical cohort here, have come from this idea of really a tall and raised soft palate position. In order to achieve these aesthetics as well, we need to allow the palate to lower to really achieve that belt function. So it's not to say we need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to consider, how long we're operating in these certain areas. And I think specifically with the laryngeal function for a moment, where people get worried is, oh, is belt dangerous? Is this sustainable? And I think if any of us sang in an elevated laryngeal position for an extended period of time, we're going to feel a tickle. We're going to maybe feel a cough. We're going to feel that there's not really a lot of endurance that may be had. But it's like anything else. And there was a question that came in with like stylistic elements. How do I sustain a 2-hour set? You're smart about how much of these stylistic parameters you're allowing to infiltrate the technique. Glottals, pop rock, cries, growls, distortion, all those things need to be present, but they can't not be the foundation if it's going to be sustainable over a long period of time. It's how you use them and where in the voice you're allowing those things to come in. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk, everybody. But it's just one of those things where I don't think there's a quick answer, to this question. And again, we probably have, 4 vastly different answers to it. But I will say there are some things I think many of us will come back to as points of departure. So.
It's such a great answer. I want to just not even say anything, but I'm going to just say one thing. I feel like we can have a NATS chat on each genre, an entire NATS chat. And then you could discuss, the differences in, well, for, country, well, I guess which kind of country, right? See, now we're getting to that. But see, then we'd have a whole NATS chat to talk about. What is the laryngeal position? What, are we using twang? How is that affecting soft palate and nasality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think figuring out, and I don't want to use the word recipe or formula or anything like that, but sort of the combination of, ingredients when you're baking your cake of, that specific genre and that specific style of that specific song, which technical aspects will you be focusing on specifying in specific ways, and then which style elements combine with that. And then I think then you've got your cake, but it is different for every single style.
We've got a ton of questions, so let's see if we can work through answering, because there are some awesome questions coming in. We've talked about this a little bit. I'm going to revisit. So Christine says, my concern is if one teaches or encourages laryngeal position changes the potential for possible vocal harm based on the widely accepted voice science, voice anatomy, and physiology principles of best optimum habitual laryngeal position, e.g. Tietz's pendulum example, need to be careful not to sway too far away from the center. So I don't know who wants to, I mean, I'll just say for me, and I talk about it in my book, I call it neutral low and neutral high, depending on, you know, that the larynx does have a range depending on the aesthetic that we want. Does anybody want to respond to this? I'm not sure if you're kind of implying that maybe you're concerned about if the larynx is high, and I'm sure Justin doesn't mean that. You mentioned that you don't want it to sustain an elevated position for a long time or you'd get in trouble, obviously.
Right. And I love the way you describe it, Kari. You know, one term that I come back to a lot is laryngeal neutrality. Can we reset? Yeah. And another term that I use often is counterbalance, right? If we're doing this on one side, we need to then balance it in the other side. And so when we really get into the weeds and we start to talk about belt or chest dominant function and head dominant function and laryngeal registration, thyroarytenoid dominance, you know, cricothyroid dominance, that's where we really begin to talk about this idea of counterbalance and seesaw. So I think, you know, no, regardless of the style, it's impossible to endure elevated laryngeal position for an extended period of time. But we can achieve the appropriate level of elevation so long as we counterbalance. So we're cultivating this sense of flexibility and we're coming back to, like you describe it, neutral. I think that's a really important part of the equation here.
Well, and it's also why we cross-train now, why we teach cross-training. And of course, cool down. You know, my research was in cool down for the Van Loren. So if you spend an extensive amount of time in a belt aesthetic, then when you take that into account to reset the voice back to neutral. And my research demonstrated that subjectively gave the singers a great deal of peace of mind on the other side of that. Melissa, Elizabeth, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there, but anything you guys would
The cool down is so important. I absolutely think it underpins everything I do. I always teach it. It's so crucial, especially for roles that are very vocally demanding, especially like a TA dominant belting role. You got to do those head voice cool downs. So I think there's a big difference between allowing your larynx to elevate and putting it in a high position. And I think that's important to draw that distinction, that like sort of ordering up a recipe of positions in the vocal tract is something that's a valid methodological approach for some folks. But I think that the danger there is sort of getting stuck, is this idea that like we're putting something in a position and then we're going to keep it there. I think that's where you run the risk of injury. And like Justin said, if your larynx is high and then it gets stuck up there and you can't bring it back down, then you're in trouble. So I don't think that inherently labeling a high larynx is bad and a low larynx is good, I don't think that's helpful. But I think that sort of understanding that we want all of these structures to be flexible and to be able to return to a neutral mode where things like to be when I'm talking is my neutral, and that's going to look different. My configuration is going to be different than Justin's or Melissa's or Kari's or anybody else. So I think that that's knowing your instrument, knowing yourself, knowing your own defaults, knowing what feels good. This is why it's so important to say to a student, how does it feel? And for them to have the proprioception to sort of tell you and for them to awaken those skills also during their course of study. But I think that sort of the idea of manipulating the vocal tract and putting it in positions so that we're in an aesthetic, I think that that's problematic when we're talking about fixed positions. But I think recognizing that we want something that's in the range of higher than we would have with classical is appropriate for the style. And that's just about sort of awakening possibilities and maybe a default from your training. And certainly, I mean, I went through the process of learning how to belt when I was 27. It was, and after a lot of years of singing classical, it was a lot of like, oh my gosh, I'm so bad at this. First of all, it was hard to be bad at things. And then it just felt so different, you know, and I would finish singing and I felt very different than when I was singing my classical repertoire. So I think that just understanding that it's all going to be different.
And also understanding that every student's perception of what you're saying is different, right? And so guiding, stopping and asking questions and using a scaffolded approach when you're talking about these things, rather than, there are a lot of things, if your larynx is stuck up there, well, why? And that might be different. There's a different, culprit or reason, in one student than the other, and making sure that you're taking the time to, again, keep going back to the function and figuring out the student's baseline and the student's, most effortless approach, and then continuing back into the scaffold of the style and or more elements of function that lead to the style of that genre is important. So I guess I could have said, make sure patience and one step at a time, if I wanted to say that simply.
Let's talk about mixed voice. That's such a hot topic. We could have a whole chat on that, but in just a couple minutes, any advice or really even before the advice, what thoughts specifically do you have about mixed voice, in quotes there, with this context of pop rock? And then do you have a little fun exercise maybe that you use to help people facilitate that?
I think it's important for us to maybe ask what do we mean when we say mix. So that's a word that has a lot of different meanings for different folks. And I found out too, just to make matters more complicated, here in the United States in the musical theater industry, when there's an audition call and they say mix, they mean head dominant singing. But in the UK, that's not always true. Sometimes they mean a chest dominant mix of some kind, but they call it mix. And so it's I think you have to ask what that actually means. So I think, for pop rock singing, when I'm teaching those styles to my musical theater singers, we actually don't talk a lot about mix. We're usually talking about a belt sound or like a very light, breathy head voice. And those are the two sort of like, I think, technical pillars. Now, mix, of course, comes into play. I'm not saying it doesn't. And when I say mix, I mean a head dominant mix, which is sort of your classical default sound for a soprano or a mezzo. So I think that in the musical theater industry, we have to use the term because they use it. And so it sort of ends up coming over into pedagogy. But I think with my students, I'm very clear to sort of like say, is this head dominant? Is it chest dominant? So that we're really clear, because those could both be mixed. So yeah, so I'll punt this to my colleagues here because I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, I'll just quickly add, with the head dominant and chest dominant, a lot of times we'll talk about that sort of as a constantly moving spectrum, right? And that's, while it's different for every single artist as well, what is your head dominant feel like, sound like, and what's your most comfortable position and place on the spectrum, that will differ. But let's just say you're approaching a specific style or a song within a style. We might talk about within head dominant, how much so, and then how do you get there,
I guess I might add, isn't it all a mix, physiologically speaking?
That's what I'm saying.
I like to talk about levels of engagement, and with students, and one of the, well, I should say, a methodology that I really have had a bit of success with is a vowel-driven approach, because we really get into the weeds with students, right? And we can't always have some of these higher level conversations because there's not time, nor is there always a place, depending upon the level of the student. So I think it's necessary to investigate how we can achieve some of these things. Coming back though to Elizabeth's comment, specifically in regards to this idea of mixing, and when we think about, I don't know, TA dominant, CT dominant, head dominant, chest dominant, and we go further into function, if the CT muscle is responsible for pitch, right? So isn't it always in some capacity, engaging? So I don't know, I don't think there's an easy answer to this, and it's something we're all coming back to, but I just like to describe it as levels of engagement. What's the percentage of chest in the sound as opposed to what's percentage of head? And it's coming back to that idea of counterbalance and seesaw. Certain vowels put us into more predominantly one function over the other. You think about the oo vowel specifically and what that does, and it puts us into more of a hooty placement. So it's not to say that one can't belt on an oo vowel, but it's a much harder vowel to use to get a true belt aesthetic. Similarly, you know, ah is great. We use ah all the time. Ah is challenging for a number of reasons. We can have a whole NATS chat on ah, right? Specifically in contemporary styles. No, nobody wants to come to that. But, you know, ah is particularly challenging too, based on the level of openness, you know. And so when we're talking about ah and we're talking about registrational shifts, or dare I say delaying those, there's a real time and a place to be able to implement that. But, you know, for a lot of people, specifically like AFAB singers, taking ah up too high does not then allow for a smooth transition. Perhaps though, in some styles, we want that because we want to play into the flip in the voice, right? We want to play into the break. That's necessary in certain pop rock styles. So this is not an easy answer, but I think it sort of gets us moving here. I just come back to, I think it's all a mix. It's all about levels of engagement and how we navigate that.
Two things I want to say. I years ago heard Ingo say, aren't we almost always in some kind of mix? And I've ridden that platform for years because of that. It's like, well, Ingo kind of says this, and, you know, almost we're in some shades of gray, which is why I have the slide rule in my book of from laryngeal configuration and then resonance strategy. And we're just always on a slide rule of those two things. The other thing, just in case people don't know, Justin said AFAB. I just want to make sure people know he's referring to assigned female at birth, in case people aren't familiar with that term. Let's see. Someone says, do any of you feel that you can achieve vocal timbre differences through epilaryngeal area changes versus laryngeal height adjustments?
Can you
I do.
question for me?
Go ahead, Melissa.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just asked if she could repeat.
Yes, I'll repeat that. Do you feel that you can achieve vocal timbre differences through epilaryngeal area changes versus laryngeal height adjustments? And I'd say
I do.
pharyngeal
Yeah,
wall, I would add to that, the pharyngeal wall.
Yes, I think there's so many factors to vocal tract shaping, and laryngeal height is certainly one of the factors, but there's so many other structures that have a variable range of positions they can be in and enter into and exit flexibly. So I think that the AES, narrowing area epiglottic sphincter from the Estel model is helpful, or it's also called twang. And it's that cry sound that's in a lot of belting. And so I would say for me, it's ubiquitous. We use it all the time in all my training. And it's a sound you tap into. It's sort of like a dial. You turn it up, you turn it down. But it's a big factor for sure, and a really helpful technical pillar.
Anyone else want to address that one specifically? Okay, we'll move to another question. I love.
I will quickly just say very quickly, because I think, Elizabeth, that was a brilliant answer. But I think anytime we're, you know, manipulating the vocal tract, we have the opportunity for a timbral shift. You know, we're changing, you know, the makeup. We're changing sort of the posture, if you will, internally. And I think there's always that opportunity for, you know, us to manipulate, you know, timbral qualities in the voice, for sure.
And I love this. Somebody has just said, my resonance strategies cause the difference in laryngeal position without having to deliberately alter it or ask for it.
Well, and I was just going to add that sometimes, you know, it's not necessarily isolation. So sometimes, you know, a change in, you know, AES will shift something else, right? And you can choose to do that. You know, you can choose to have, you know, nasal twang or oral twang or both. You know, there are so many different factors, but a lot of times they happen authentically and in partnership with one another.
Justin, we have a question. Oh, so I'm so sorry, Elizabeth.
No, that's fine. No, I would just say that resonance strategies and like the vowel shape and the vocal tract shape, like for me, those are all the same thing. So you know, we can call it a resonance strategy, or I might just call it a vowel shape. or, you know, cry in the sound, or like there's a number of different ways I would pedagogically help a student access the sound I'm after. And it's sort of all under that umbrella. It's all a resonance strategy of some kind.
Justin, there's a question for you as you were talking earlier about breath. And could you give any examples of different ways of using the breath as you listed? And is it just the amount of air? Is it a higher breath? Do low abs still get engaged, etc.?
Yeah, you know, well, first of all, I should say, as many of us are aware, breathing is such a personal endeavor. And so everybody feels the breath in a different way. And I think that it's a valuable thing to consider regardless of what genre or style we're teaching in, you know, whether that be classical, musical theater, CCM, you know, where we consider how we're approaching this. But I think much of it, you know, has to be influenced, or dare I say, a result of what the text, you know, and sort of where we are. I don't want to say dramatically, but, you know, where are we, you know, on that scale, if you will. So I think much of those decisions need to be a result of what's on the page. So I can't safely say that in country music, you know, we need this type of breathing approach. I can probably make a generalization in saying that we can get away with higher breaths. We can get away with, you know, filling the tank a bit less, as I talked about with the airplane analogy. But it's so situational. I think, though, the way in which we use the air is a consideration that we could make. You know, the calibration of airflow more specifically. But again, you know, it's so specific depending upon what, you know, the style is, and also the emotional content, I think, is really a big part of it. If we're in a heightened emotional state, the breath needs to be higher. If the breath is low, we're not sort of, you know, capturing, you know, that aesthetic. It's not, as Elizabeth said too, it's like that cry in the sound. It's very difficult to cry with a very low thoracic breath, you know. It's one of those things that are inherently higher and a little bit more clavicular. So I think, like anything else, it's about balancing. That's what I come back to.
And I would say too that can change too depending on your sound system. So if you're looking at being amplified, if you've got a condenser mic that's highly sensitive, you know, you can really utilize the soft spectrum of singing, the barely audible whisper. It can be part of your performance. And if you know, come from classical singing where we're always training to be unmiked, you're not able to access that sector of the dynamic spectrum. And so, you know, breath is very different when you're talking about soft volumes. And then depending on where you are in the range and what the vowel is and what's happening physically, are you doing a triple pirouette at the same time? Or are you on a raked stage? Are you wearing a corset or heels? All of these things, of course, impact what we can do with our breath. And I always say to my students, we need a multitude of approaches. We need to understand that this is a moving system that's going to be constantly variable depending on a lot of external factors, and then like what exactly is happening in the music, like Justin said, just what does the music call for, what is necessary, and then what's going to be the most efficient configuration of your breath so that you're not tired at the end of that song, or you're not running out of breath or running into problems with all the other things you're balancing.
Elizabeth, earlier somebody asked you to explain efficiency, which I use every day of my life. What do you mean when you use that term? Would you like to expand on that?
I think it was Melissa who talked about it, actually.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Melissa. That is who the question was for. I apologize.
No, that's great. And I want to say, I think Justin and I both use that. I don't want to steal his word thunder. But yes, efficiency. It is, what is the most direct path, you know, an effortless path a student can go down to achieve the sound, right? So efficiency with breath control, efficiency with, you know, breath intake, efficiency with just what Elizabeth was saying, you know, when you're using microphone technique. So, I mean, and I'm using efficiency across the board as far as effort, you know, as far as what is the, and I don't mean don't try, clearly, you know, and obviously singing is work, and we all know that, but it's just what what is unnecessary effort? What is effort that is only tension, right? And how do we strip that away to get to the purest route towards the goal? That's what I mean. So it's a very general, all-encompassing term, because I want them to be efficient in, in all of their approaches to, even something as simple as how they're on, how's their onset? Is that efficient? And that onset could be, a breathy onset or a glottal onset. It could be, there's an aspirate, there's a million ways I could say that, but I still want you to do it, efficiently. How much air do you need to push through that? How much do you need to engage on that onset, etc. So what is the exact right amount of air, of energy, right, to execute properly?
Yeah, it really comes down to the ability to sing high intensity with low effort, right? So that we have good vocal health and therefore ability to be artistic, I think. We could go on and on, my goodness, these wonderful questions coming in, but last kind of question, what do you all think with regards to style that we as teachers are most most missing or need to improve upon our understanding in style of pop rock, especially those that maybe come from a choral background or a classical training background? What are we missing? What would you like to see more understanding with regards to style and pop rock?
Well, I guess I'll jump in here to say that I would love to see the voice being used more as a rhythmic maker. I think we get lost in this idea of long lines because they are efficient and they are sustainable. But when we trace everything back, to tribal music and communication, we come back to this idea of the roots of pop rock and the idea that the voice is being used as a communicative device, and the voice is being used with rhythmic gestures, and that really set the foundation for pop and rock. And I think Matt Edwards sort of spells this out so eloquently in his book, So You Want to Sing Rock and Roll, but just provides that historical perspective, and those qualities are present. I think regardless of where you look, and coming back to this idea of subgenre, there's such a rhythmic element in most of the canon that I think without the presence of using the voice as a rhythmic maker, as a percussive element, if you will, style really suffers. So I think that's somewhere I think we could all afford to spend a little bit more time. But let me also say that I think we're all lifelong learners here, and none of us have all the answers, but I want to come back to this idea of like exploration, and this idea that if we can continue to be open and continue to listen and engage in these sorts of platforms, I think we're all better off for it. And certainly it's such a daunting and very deep world, the pop rock world. It's exciting, it's thrilling, but there's so much as a pedagogue that I think we feel we need to be responsible for. And I don't think any of us are claiming to be an expert in any of these areas, but what we're trying to do is to find the way by which we can communicate it, with the most effective practice to our students. And that's what it's all about at the end of the day.
And acknowledging that language and concepts, some language more than anything, can be a minefield in our field of voice teaching. So, it's like, call it a duck, call it a goose, right? Call it a cow, right? As long as you and your students understand what you're labeling, I would just love to see our profession get less combative. And I think we have the last decade. Really, we've improved a lot since my day. I'm an Indiana University trained classical singer, so we've come a long way. Melissa,
what is registration?
What was that?
What is registration? That's where we begin.
Well, I'll refer you.
I'll just add, I want to just add that not to miss the history behind the genre and behind pop rock and these styles that influenced the genre to make it the genre. I think approaching a genre authentically is unmistakably interwoven with understanding the history and, you know, the socio-political climate in which that musical, you know, was birthed. Like I said, the influences that you know, that made the style what it is, and the people who, you know, made that style, and then who are the people who influenced those people, and the cultures. What culture does this come from? And, you know, and please trace that back. It will help your authenticity in your own sound and in your understanding of the genre. I think it will make it more enjoyable to listen to and to teach. And I mean, and is it weird to say? I guess it makes us more responsible, you know, learners, teachers, singers, artists. That sounds like such a soapbox. I'm doing that too. Like, trying to remember the history of all of that. But that's something I try to keep in mind, especially in genres that I'm not as familiar with.
What a perfect way to end this. And there will be a NATS chat on that exact idea later this year, Melissa. So thank you for that segue and that plug, actually. Well, thank you, my dear guests, for joining us. I know we could go on, and maybe we'll have another chat where we get even further into the weeds with specificity of technique as our intent. But I wanted to present broad strokes. I wanted to help our community understand that we as a profession are aware that we need to be having this conversation, and this is where it starts. I hope everybody will join us. A couple invitations. We have our NATS National Conference this July 1st through 5th in Chicago again this year. So I hope you will register and go online at nats.org, and the program is up. You can see the sessions that are being planned right now. Also on February 6th will be my next NATS chat, and it's called Voice Studio Shenanigans with Shannon Coates and Nikki Loney. So you know it'll be funny and fun and a good time, and we're going to talk about using play, exploration, and improvisation to build confidence and independent singing skills in children and adolescents, and maybe even in adult singers too. So I hope you'll join us February 6th for that. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe. Here's for 2022 that looks a little different in 2023 January. But in the meantime, be safe and be well. And thank you, dear guests and attendees, for joining us tonight. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.